2 tonight. I want to welcome everybody, especially those of you also, not especially, also those of you that are, I just made you guys feel like dirt. Those of you that are online, we want to welcome you as well, not especially. But we're in part 2 tonight, so I say that because we're in a very, very sensitive topic, talking about same-sex relationships and the church's response to that, and this is part 2. So if you are here tonight, I'm going to do a fast, quick review. Everybody said, yeah, right. But in all seriousness, tonight has to be taken in connection to the foundation that we set last week as we go through this together. Where we said, fast review, we said that it's absolutely imperative that we qualify the question. I made the point last week that answering questions like, is same-sex marriage wrong, that there's all kinds of things wrong with that. For starters, how do you define wrong? When you're talking with somebody in the culture, when you're talking with a friend or a colleague, how does that person define right or wrong versus you? You know, and then why are you talking regarding marriage as opposed to just relationships in general? Because the church has an opinion about sex outside of marriage, regardless of heterosexual versus homosexual. And so we qualify the question, and we said that the right question to get a person, that if a person wants to dialogue with you as a Christian, the right question talk is, and it can be any variance of this, it doesn't have to be verbatim this, but we said the right question would be, what does God have to say about same-sex relationships according to the Scriptures? And the reason I think that that is a verifiable question for you to dialogue in is that, A, it's not your opinion. You're talking about what you believe God has to say, because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what you or I think. We're not the people that define right or wrong. Only God does. And we said that it talks about same-sex relationships, not marriage, because once you define your opinion, or once you define what you believe God has to say about relationships, your opinion on marriage will follow. And we said, according to the Scriptures, you are inserting into that essentially the measuring tape, the ruler. You're saying that I'm going to define this according to the Scriptures, not according to my own opinion or according to anything else. So the first thing we did was we qualified the question. The second thing we did is we said that it's the right way to approach the topic of same-sex relationships is to talk about it in the broader discussion, what the church calls theology, but the broader description of how the Scriptures talk about human sexuality. That to just jump straight into the element of same-sex relationships or homosexuality without taking into account all the Scriptures have to say about sexuality, that's a really dangerous way to go, because without the context, what we risk as a church, and I say what we have risked because I have seen answers and responses, and I've read books on these matters, is that the danger is to think that the culture just wants us to tell us yes, no, right, wrong, as opposed to why. For me, the more important question for the church to answer is why we think a certain way. Why do we believe the Scripture says that? And not just because it's found in this chapter, this verse of this book, but if we would hold any kind of an angle about God's opinion, then why does God think that way about those elements? And so we said that to do that, you have to essentially divide the Scriptures into kind of 4 parts, because the Scriptures are a narrative, we said. The Scriptures are not just a loose collection of passages or laws or writings or whatever the case may be that you would define. We said the Scriptures are a narrative. The Scriptures are the Spirit's speaking into the authors to construct this narrative about God's plan of redemption for all of humanity, everybody. When I say everybody, that it's offered to every single person. Not everybody's going to make use of it. But that the Scriptures are ultimately this narrative, and that it has essentially 4 scenes. If you were to think about it in the way of a movie or a book, that there's essentially 4 scenes to it. There's the creation, which speaks to God's original intent and design, and then there's the fall at which sin ultimately destroys things. And then there is where Christ shows up and offers redemption, and ultimately it ends with glorification. And when we divide into that, we said, and this is as far as we got last week, as we broke into it and said that when we look at the story of creation, what we learn is this, is that God, as an artist, stamps into his creation an image that is intended to reflect his desired relationship with us. That he wants us to see from the physical the reality of the spiritual. He intentionally designed every single element of every single part of creation with meaning. It's intended to illustrate how he is as the creator. so that we would understand him, so that we would know him. And we said that there's three main things that we learn from creation. Again, this is all last week. We said we learned that he's a relational God who desires us. And we looked at that part of the scripture where it says that God brought every single element, all the animals of creation to Adam. And Adam named them, he dialogued them, but it wasn't until God brought woman that Adam went, boom! And that's where it got good last week, right? And we said that that's intentional, that when you look at that passage, it's not just intended to go, hey, man and woman like each other. It was intended for the illustration to say that that's exactly why God created us. And we said that woman was created to correspond to man, not to be a clone of him, but to correspond to him, and that we were supposed to be in the same exact fashion. Then we said that we saw that when God invents, and that's exactly what he did, and when he invented human sexuality, he was intending to show that he is a creational God who enjoys new life, and that he creates sex as this vehicle to create life. And that there was supposed to be that understanding that in the same way that the woman opens and receives herself to a man, and again, adult conversations, so you were warned, just hang in there, that in the same way that a woman opens herself to a man, that as creation opens itself to God, the potential of life, it's all an illustration, every part of it. And finally, we said it reflects a familial God, that God shows this, that out of sexuality, that humanity has the capacity to create a family, and that God ultimately desires in that family. And we went through all of that, and I said one of the primary things that we're doing, and we'll complete it tonight, is that I'm teaching it in this format because what I'm ultimately trying to do, and I don't know that I was clear enough on this last week, is I'm ultimately trying to show you the contextual mindset of Paul when Paul wrote Romans chapter 1. Why? Because Romans chapter 1 is the proof text that every Christian, and I have been to the seminars, I have read the books, I have watched the webinars, I have listened to the podcast, and there are churches that do things where they kind of script Christians as opposed to teaching them what God thinks about this. They instead script Christians on here's how you defeat the arguments, here's how you prove the culture wrong, and limited value. But what they often do is Romans 1 is the benchmark. Romans 1 is the place where Paul will say towards the end of the chapter that this is where God calls homosexuality depraved. He says it's man is inflamed with lust with man, and women have unnatural lust for other women, and people go, see, it's right there. And they ignore the entirety of the rest of Romans chapter 1. But when you look at Romans 1, what you'll see is that Paul is picking up the entirety of the story. He opens the entire chapter by showing this familial God, this God who wants a family, this God who desires to have his lost kids come home. And Paul says, even though I'm a Jew, I was given a call to go and get the Gentiles, to pull them in because God desires family. And then he says this in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, exactly what we just said through the 3 points of creation. He says in the chapter that God's creation is intended to show his power, his nature, so that through what is seen, you can understand that which is unseen. Paul is not, in Romans 1, just trying to write some kind of a dry legal statement about same-sex relationships. He is talking and telling in the context of the story of who God is and what God ultimately wants. And so, for each of these sections, we want to see how Paul will bring this story into Romans 1 so that we can take the context of it. This is where we left off last week. We said, then the story turns to the fall. Satan comes in, convinces man that he can go without God. Man disconnects from God, that in the same way that you disconnect your phone or your iPad from the outlet or from the charger, you know from that point on you are limited in your time before you have to reconnect again, or death of that device is certain. Satan convinces man he can disconnect, but more than just convincing man to disconnect from God, the temptation he gives to man is he says to him in the garden, you know what? If you go it your own way, God knows that you will be as he is or like him. In other words, Satan's ultimate trick is to get man to reject his correspondence to God and try to instead be God's clone. And in that rejection, we see the entirety of creation fall apart. Now, here's what's key, and I want you to hear this. The scriptures do not present sin as some category of abuses. The scriptures do not present sin as this catalog or encyclopedia of acts that are wrong. Scripture presents sin as a condition. It's an infection. It's the equivalency of cancer. Scriptures define sin as a condition that humanity becomes infected with as a result of its decision to abandon God. And because of that infection, we begin to see that the story in this, throughout the Scriptures tells us the results of all this. What are the conditions? The first is that we learn that the entire created order, because of that sin, is breaking down. The entire created order. That includes you and me. We're part of the creation. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8 that the creation was subjected to frustration and is currently in a state of decay. All of it. I've heard the illustration used before, and I think it's a viable one. I've heard the illustration that creation is the equivalency of a ship that is in the middle of the ocean and is sinking. There is a hole in it, there is time that is limited, and ultimately it is going down. And you say, why the entirety of the creation? Because God gave that to us, to humanity. Ultimately, his design from the beginning was that we would be the stewards, that we would be the rulers. And again, not to go back to part one, but that ultimately that this was supposed to be our kingdom to oversee. And because we dismissed God, because we departed from God, the entirety of it is in a state of decay. All of it. But more importantly, part two, is that what we learn in the story is that humanity becomes blinded to God, turns the focus on itself. We lose sight of God as a result of it. Remember, he created us in his image, but because we disconnect from him, we lose the ability, we lost the ability completely to see this picture. They're not hip now, nor do we ever use the word hip. Sorry. But at one point in my lifetime, I don't know when, there was a popularity fad of 3D style pictures. Anybody remember these? They were flat, they were posters, and they were and when you look at it, you couldn't see. It gave you a headache. It was like this kaleidoscope of patterns and designs, and you would stare at it, and then ultimately, for some people it worked and for others it didn't, but if you would stare at it, all of a sudden the picture would emerge into a 3D representation, and you would go, there it is! And all of a sudden, like a horse would emerge or a rocket. And you'd go, I see it now. And then the person standing next to you would be going, I don't see anything. And you'd be like, it would just emerge. But then all of a sudden, you would just, for a moment, if you even blinked your eyes, it'd be gone again. Anybody as old as I am on these things? No, those illustrations fall apart and fail. The people online get it, which is why we especially love you. None of them got it. But that's what happened, that the illustration that God put into creation as a result of sin was lost. We became blinded. That's why throughout the Scriptures, over and over again, God is referred to as invisible. He's referred to as unseen, because man can't see him. There was a period in the creation where he could commune with Adam and Eve, where he could walk in the garden, but that was lost. And more than just us losing visibility, we learn that Satan capitalizes on that and further blinds us so that we can't see ultimately what he's doing. And the end result is what we would just call a complete state of inverted confusion, where we're no longer looking at God, we're looking at ourselves. Think about the story of the 10 Commandments, where Moses is called up on top of Mount Sinai for God to deliver to him the revelation in the commandments, because it's been lost to creation and its visibility, so God has to work through a legal system of laws to unveil himself. And while he's up there, while Moses is on Mount Sinai, what's taking place at the foot of the mountain? The people have gathered together and they're calling on Aaron, and they tell Aaron this phrase. They say, hey, we should make gods. Think about the complete lunacy of that statement. We, humanity, the created, should make gods who can then be over us. Do you get the inverted order there? Notice how much in that single statement sin has completely, there is the knowledge, humanity is showing the evidence inside of us that it understands that it needs some form of authority or deity, but then it thinks that it's in a position to create it itself. The created is trying to be the creator. The complete inversion of the order, the complete breakdown, the inability to know that God's even there and to think that, well, we can then create for ourselves. And I make all of that background in case because, again, Paul will bring that into Romans chapter 1. Paul trying to show in Romans 1 how bad things broke down when sin entered the story. Says that what humanity did was exchange the glory of an immortal God for images made to look like us. Ultimately, what humanity did was it exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and it worshiped and it served created things as opposed to the Creator. Again, just to set the context, Romans chapter 1 is a story that Paul is trying to relate the entirety of this, all throughout of it. And what ultimately happens is that you see that even in that state of fallenness, even there, God does not abandon his illustration. God does not abandon how he intentionally had put sexuality into humanity to ultimately define his relationship to us. Instead, God capitalizes on that imagery. And so all throughout the scripture, after the fall, God continues to use the illustration of sex to define what's taken place. He tells one prophet by the name of Hosea, he tells Hosea, he says, I want you to do something for me. It's going to be a picture illustration, a physical illustration that will be seen in the streets. I want you to go marry a prostitute. And she's going to bear illegitimate children conceived through prostitution. Why is he asking Hosea to do this? Because he's going to use that as a physical illustration and say, because why? Because the nation is continually committing spiritual prostitution against me. God's wife has left us. See the illustration? Sex was his illustration at the beginning, and he continually illustrates and uses that over and over and over again. And the number of times in the Old Testament that God resorts to a sexual illustration to talk about this, I said last week, it is the moment in the movie where it is just heart-wrenching, breaking, that what was thought to be this grand relationship or marriage you find is a fraud because she has left and she's slept with someone else. Not just slept with someone else, slept with multiple people and has destroyed it completely. He says to the prophet Ezekiel to speak, talking ultimately to the Hebrews. And he says to them, this is God speaking, he says, your fame spread among the nations because of how beautiful you were. Your beauty was perfect. Because of all the splendor that I bestowed on you. This is God. This is him. You have to grasp the illustration. This is the husband talking to his wife. But you trusted in that beauty and you capitalized on that fame. And what did you do? You became a prostitute. A lot of translations love to use kind of cleaned up language. I feel like the better translation in the Hebrew is you became a whore. You offered your sexual favors to every man who passed by. You gave your beauty to him. You'd sleep with whoever. You don't care anymore. This imagery, why does God over and over and over and over again use this imagery? Because sexuality was his design. Sexuality was his masterpiece. It was his mastermind. Sex was supposed to be the illustration of showing who he is relationally, who he is creationally. And so when man broke away, that illustration would carry forward, but it would have terrible, terrible images associated with it. Because sin for us spiritually is just as devastating. It's a condition, it's not a set of acts. Sin has caused us to go off and essentially sleep with everything else in the creation other than our Creator. We will entertain anything and everything that makes us feel good. That's how the imagery, and again, the point that we're making here is that God carries this illustration forward over and over and over again because sex was a design to illustrate who he was. That was the purpose from the beginning. The third thing that happens in the fall, the third condition we see is that ultimately order has been completely inverted. We're ruled. We're not in rulership anymore. We're ruled. We're ruled by our appetites. We're ruled by our desires. Everything has been completely inverted. That whereas God had designed us to be a royal priesthood, to be rulers who would rule over it, who would know him in his creation, the entire thing gets inverted, and now we are ruled by the physical and the created order. Genesis chapter 4, He tells man, sin's crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but now you have to rule over it. So out of all of the animals and the relationship at the beginning and man's predominance over the created order, man ultimately now is told that he is now going to be prey to a predator, which is his own desires. The brokenness of the entire system. It's why Jesus will instruct his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, teaching them to pray, trying to teach them and instruct them about what it means to follow him. And he tells them this phrase, the spirit's willing, but your flesh is infected and it's weak. Over and over and over again, this kind of imagery. John writes, for everything in the world, the cravings of sinful people, the lust of their eyes, their boasting about what they have and do, doesn't come from the Father. The world gives all that. The inversion. The created is now ruling us. The creation rules us. Our desires, our appetites control us. James writes that each of us is tempted when we're dragged away by our own desires. Our own desires can manipulate us. Our own desires control us. This is all part of the fall. This is what happens. We lost rulership. We become ruled. James says when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And incidentally, the language, the sexuality language of conceiving, that all of this is intentional. When sin's full grown, it ultimately gives birth to death. That's the state of a creation that has fallen and separated from its creator. And the result, like I said, is that appetites, that the physical now dominates as opposed to the spiritual. That's why you have things like gluttony, where food was designed to be enjoyed, where food was designed ultimately to be nutrition and to be fuel. How do we treat it today? Purely for pleasure. And so there has to be instructions. The Proverbs tell us, listen, my son, be wise. Set your heart on the right path. Don't join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat. For drunkards and gluttons, they become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. Gluttony. We can't even control ourselves when it comes to food. We don't even have the willpower to say no to a donut, or 3, or 5, or 12. I've told the story before about when the Krispy Kreme that opened a mile from my house, and I knew it was danger when I saw the construction and the banner that said, coming soon. And it said Krispy Kreme, and I said, the banner said, coming soon, your death. And on opening day, I stopped by to pick up a dozen donuts for us just to sample. And I walked in, and the person said at the counter said, we have a deal going of buy a dozen, get a dozen free. And I said, if it's free, it's... Thank you. It's for me. And then she said, do you want assorted or plain? I said, plain is fine. And she said, oh, well, if you're getting plain, we actually will give you a third. I came home that night with 3 dozen donuts. I only live in a family of 3. My wife, who is gluten-free, she doesn't even, so it was really me and Kyle. And we killed every single one of them because of sin. Gluttony. Greed. Our desire to control, to hoard, to pull together, which is why Jesus has to teach in Luke 12 through a parable. He teaches this story about a guy who doesn't have any concern or care for others, who is not a relational individual. This person only cares for themselves, and so they build and they hoard and they build and they hoard, and then ultimately they go, you know what, I'm just going to keep building bigger and bigger and bigger silos to hold all the grain in the farm. And then ultimately Jesus tells this story and says that God says to this man, you fool, you're actually losing your life tonight. Then who's going to get all of this stuff? And this is how it will be for anybody else who stores things up for themselves, people who are stricken by greed, who are controlled by that desire to have and to own. This is what the fallen world looks like. Jealousy. It's why in the 10 Commandments there's the call not to covet somebody else, because we're ruled by other things. People get other things. They get other possessions. They get other positions. They get other points of power. They get whatever the case is, and we start to go, man, I wish I had that. That's what happens. And in that setting where appetites take over, where bodily just desires, what the scriptures talk about as the flesh, where that takes over, we learn in the scripture that God's design in sexuality is equally infected. It's not just food. It's not just money. It's not just power. That sex is ultimately that God's unique illustration, the masterpiece of his creation and design, the thing that was going to really, really, really encapsulate the point of his illustration with his creation, human sexuality. Sin destroys and just rips that apart. And the story becomes intensely sad. For the first time, rape is introduced. It's never in God's mind. Notice the language. It says, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he did what? Just took her. There's no consent. The violence behind that. Why is rape so incredibly offensive to God's design in the scripture? Because that has nothing of any kind of a bearing on God's character. He does not force himself on anybody. He does not take violently. God cares. God is compassionate. God is concerned. God wants willing reception back, and so rape destroys all of it. It paints a portrait. If sexuality is the illustration of the Creator, then rape brings into this notion that it can be just taken by force. Don't wait for the other person. You take what you want. It robs it. It destroys it. And every single element where sexuality becomes perverted in the process, you can now understand, if you can grasp that human sexuality is an illustration God gave to look to him, to see him, then you understand why other things start to fall apart. Masturbation. Why is that? Why would the church have a position? Because it's self-pleasuring, self-centering. You don't need anybody else. It further degrades the picture of a creator that wants it to be relational, as opposed to a creator that just is in it for himself. Pornography completely destroys the image further because the other person is no longer there for you to relate to. The other person is just an object, again, for your self-centeredness. Selfishness, self-centeredness, a desire just to use it for your own pleasure and then discard it. And the reason that the Creator has an opinion is not because he goes, ew, that's dirty, but because it further takes from this creation his image. It further erases it so that people become further blinded to who he is. You follow with me? Sexual sins. The reason that God has an opinion is because it was his design to point to him, and anything that erases that, it's more of a brokenheartedness on his part because it erases a person's comprehension of the Creator. And inside of that, homosexuality is talked about in the scriptures for the first time. Leviticus 18:22. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, talking to another man. Why? That's the bigger question. Why? Because it erases the image of God. It eliminates the other gender. When I say it eliminates the other gender, it eliminates that design we looked at last week. And at this point, if you have not reviewed last week, you have to for this to make any sense. But remember how the design was announced in Genesis chapter 1. That God created humanity in his image, and then it says, male and female, he created them. And then says in the story, the elaboration of that story in Genesis 2 is that he made the female to correspond to the man so that life could have potential. And the reason that God says as a law, the reason he even has to come up with this is because the perverted order, when I say the perverted, the inverted, the perverted, the perversion of his order, of his image, is that creation only focuses on its own self, on its own desires, and sexuality becomes an erasure of God's image. And in homosexuality, you have removed the corresponding gender, you have removed life-giving potential. That's by God's design, by the way. The very element in a homosexual relationship that points to a creator's statement against it is that the life-giving potential isn't there. Can't create life. And there's all kinds of side steps where people say, but they love each other, or we love each other, or it's two consenting adults, and go, that wasn't the purpose for it. The purpose for it was to be an illustration of what the Creator wanted originally in this creation and anything. And the reason I keep saying anything is that in Leviticus 18, another one of those proof texts that people love to come up with, Leviticus 18 is not just some statement against homosexuality. The truth is if you've never read Leviticus 18, let me give you some fun reading tonight before bed. Leviticus 18 goes through a litany of sexual problems that erase the image of the Creator. I can guarantee you God in chapter 18 of Leviticus comes up with sexual inversions that you never even thought of. I guarantee you'll read Leviticus 18 and go, I didn't even know that was a thing. Every single element of sexual inversion you can imagine is carried inside of that text. Proof of it. Leviticus 18, sex. No man's approach any close relative to have sexual relations with her. And he keeps saying over and over again, I am the Lord. This is my design. Why does he even need to give Leviticus 18? Again, because man has lost sight of God and does not know him. And in the sexual inversion of a fallen world, his image is being erased. And even elements as small as this, Leviticus 18:19, that a man is not supposed to have sexual relations with a woman when she's on her menstrual cycle. What? Why does God care about that? I mean, these are the kinds of texts that people who know nothing about God, know nothing about church, this is the kind of stuff that when this gets out to an uneducated world, they go, man, this God, this is some crazy stuff. But in the context of human sexuality, what's God's point? Well, go back to the image. What's the image of sexuality? It's supposed to show a God that wants to relate to his creation, and then out of that, what is supposed to happen? Life. And so what God puts in order is this, that when a woman is on her menstrual cycle, what is she doing? She's excreting what is life. And it's confusion for man to try to bring life while she is exiting it. And so God says, during that period, no. Not because, ew, that's dirty, but because that goes contrary to the illustration. So abstain for that period so that the creation can understand how this relation works, because I, as God, I'm not exiting life. Or you are not exiting and I'm not trying to, you follow the point. I told you from the beginning, every single detail points to him. Every single detail. And if it in any way, shape, or form confuses his image, he says no. And so again, you can now look at Romans chapter 1 and understand that Paul, after sharing the context of the story and of God's heart, talks about the incredible just destruction of God's illustration. God gave them over in sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. The women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Their appetites overruled in the same way men abandoned natural relations for women, were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed these shameful acts with other men. Again, that passage, which most people rip out to proof text the church's position, that passage is carried in a context of a chapter that is about God's heart loss for a creation that has completely gone contrary to him. A God that is creational, relational, familial, and that creation left. And as a result of that creation leaving, God allowed it to be overtaken by that which is inverted. That's the why. The illustration he designed was lost. And again, this human sexuality is carried all throughout the rest of the story. When it comes to the story of redemption and Christ shows up, the image that was lost, the image that Adam forfeited, Christ brings back. The reason he comes in the physical image to be in the incarnation that he does is because he becomes the image of God himself that we lost. Paul says in Hebrews that he is the radiance of the glory, the exact imprint of his nature. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians That same passage that talks about the God of the world blinding our minds, he then refers to Christ as the one who is the image of God. Not only does Christ bring back God's image, he ultimately restores back to humanity the breath of God's Spirit. The very breath that we lost in the garden, the life that we lost, God brings it back, and he breathes upon his disciples and says, receive this Spirit again. What's the benefit of that Spirit? That's a course in of itself, but notice how the New Testament talks about it. One of the things that the Spirit brings back to humanity, self-control. The ability for man, under God's empowerment, to be able to subjugate the flesh underneath the Spirit again. Prior to that, we could not. The best we had were laws that God gave to simply illustrate that we could not. But it was impossible under the old covenant, and God knew that it was impossible. Absent his Spirit, we fall prey to the physical. But the giving of the Spirit brings the ability to take control again. It's why Paul writes in Ephesians 5:18, and he's only using wine as an illustration. He's talking about all sensual desires. You could put in here, do not over-engorge on Krispy Kreme donuts, which leads to gluttony, and it would still work. That's what Paul's saying here. But notice the contrast. In addition, he's not just saying don't on the physical. He's saying, but be filled with what? The Spirit. But also under the new covenant, guess what Christ does? He redeems that image of human sexuality. He restores beauty to God's design again. He speaks about himself being a husband, being a bridegroom, and he talks about us, the church, as his bride. Paul says, husbands, love your wives. Why? Because they will kill you if you don't. No, that's not what it says. He says, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Why? So that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present himself, the church, in all of her glory. Remember in the Old Testament where God was speaking to the prophet and said, I gave you this beauty, I gave you this splendor, I poured all this on you, and you took that beauty and you went and you slept with everybody else. It's a direct connection back to Paul in Ephesians. He says he wants her back in all that glory again. No spot, no wrinkle, any of that, so that she would be holy and blameless. The imagery that he gives is that God, as opposed to looking at his wife who cheats on him and sleeps with everybody going, you're out of here, I hope you die. Paul paints the story that Christ comes and dies so that he can redeem her and wash her up and clean her up and essentially restore her virginity back to her. Something that is completely impossible in the physical. But in the spiritual, with God, all things are possible. And that imagery of sexuality is redeemed by Christ, where it now becomes this image of a God who desired us at creation, and even in all of that unfaithfulness, still desires us. And even in all of your unfaithfulness, he still desires you. And no matter how long you have been outside of his grace, no matter how long you have been running with the world, he still desires you. And if you allow him, he will bring you, he will wash you, he will cleanse you, he will correspond, commune with you, he will bring life from you. That's how powerful the illustration is. Correspond with you. I love our church, by the way. I got multiple text messages of people last week that said, your teaching was so good, I'm going to correspond with my spouse on this. I won't say the percentage of men to women that sent me that text, 100 to 0. But let me just say this. When midweek makes you think of sex, that's our marketing. I've already designed our marketing posters for the fall. Come to midweek. It'll make your nights better. But then ultimately, I think the most powerful illustration in the scriptures that sexuality was something that God designed to point to him. I think this is the single most powerful illustration in all of it. If you didn't get it in all of this, follow this one. is that at the end of the story, when Christ ultimately returns and brings us into eternal communion with the Father in eternity, under glorification, marriage and sex are gone. You go, that's how the story ends? Yup. No sex in heaven. And all the guys said, just looking for something, guys, come on. Why? Why does the story tell us that upon Christ bringing us back, why does he talk? Why is Jesus saying that at the resurrection, people are neither going to marry nor be given in marriage, and there won't be sexuality? Why is it gone? I've heard people say, well, we're transformed into glowing bodies and dry. I'm like, that is the most boring thing in the world. No, the reason is this. The illustration won't be needed anymore because it's just an illustration. However great sex might be, however awesome we think of it on this side of creation, it's an illustration, but it becomes nothing once we know our Creator in full. You've heard my stories of the lawn and how much I love landscaping. Everybody has their own hobby, and when you have a hobby, you invest more in that hobby than other normal people do. So like if you're a person who appreciates really fine art, you may have photos and pictures on your wall that cost more than, like, say, our house, which we buy the photo and we look at the thing they put in the frame. We kind of like that. Put it on the wall. People stop by and go, who is that? And we go, not a clue. But they look, that's a good photo, isn't it? Came with the frame. We just put it up on the wall. We like it. It gives the feeling that there's family. We'll call it a distant cousin. That's Bob. Not a clue who Bob is. But if you like fine art, you may invest more because that's your hobby. I'm landscaping, so years ago I invested probably more than is considered sane in a lawnmower that's kind of like the Cadillac of lawnmowers. Not riding, just push, but let's just leave it at I regret the purchase. Kind of, not really. And then the day came where the truck delivered it and pulled up, and I was ready. Garage doors were open. I was at home, made sure I was going to be home that day, and the truck pulled up, and they lifted the bay door, and it had a hydraulic gate on it because it was so heavy, and they lifted it, and the box was there. I was like, ah! And they lowered the gate and took 3 guys to carry that thing into my garage, and the box was just beautifully adorned, and on the outside of the box was a picture of the lawnmower. You could see it there, and I was like, ah! Wait till I push this thing. The neighbors will swoon. They will gather at the front of the yard. They will be so jealous, and that's because sin turns appetites. But I couldn't open it right away because I knew it was going to take hours to pull this thing ultimately together. So it had to sit in my garage for about a week. And so each day I would go to work, and I would come home, and I'd get home late at night, and I would lift the garage doors, and I'd walk in, and I would just stand there by myself. It was my moment with the lawnmower. The family can wait. Dinner can wait. And I would just stand there and look at the picture on the box going, that's going to... My wife would open the door. Are you coming in? I'm like, just need a couple more minutes. Close the door. This is going to be awesome. And then the day came. It was a Saturday, and I didn't have extra work to do, and I got up early, and I made coffee, and I told the family to leave me alone, and I got the tools, and I opened the box, and over the next hour and a half, I put the lawnmower together until it sat there in all of its beauty. It was awesome. And guess what I did with the box? I trashed it. I did not keep the box. I didn't take the box and say, I love the picture and I love the real thing. Once the real thing was out and I had it, the box went to the dump. I don't even know where the box is today. I don't care where the box is today because I have the lawnmower. The illustration was limited value until I got the real thing, and once I had the real thing, the box was trash. That is what God describes human sexuality as. It's the illustration, but one day, we open the reality of eternally being in relationship with Him, and the illustration will not be necessary. And you nor I have no capacity to even imagine that. We can't even grasp that. The scriptures tell us that no eye has seen, no mind has conceived what He has. So let's just be an adult about this. It will be infinitely beyond orgasm. Yes, we had to put that word into this. A little bit, that got close to some of you going, I think I'm out. But who conceived of that concept? God. And there will be a day where our relationship with the Creator will mean that all of his illustration here will not be necessary. And yet, we, in sin, forfeit that. And every single time we let sexual inversion or perversion rule, we lose the capacity to dream of that. Does it matter? Well, you get the point. Let me move on and wrap this up, because here's what I want to do at the end of it. The key thing is this: the scriptures do not just tell us how to think about something from the standpoint of just knowledge. And what I mean is that the scriptures do not just teach us how to think about something or what to know from the standpoint of a definition. The scriptures also teach us how to handle truth. It doesn't just teach us truth. It's not just enough to just know this from an intellectual standpoint. We have to also know how to handle truth. How do we respond to these types of things? And so I want to talk real quickly about how we're supposed to handle this notion of grace versus law. The infamous story is told in the scriptures, and I wish I had the time to break it down inside the context of this, but the story is told about the woman that is dragged in front of Jesus, caught in adultery. And the Pharisees are using it. They're using her as an object. They're just using it to try to trap Jesus. They're hoping that they can just kind of find some element of hypocrisy. And so they drag this woman caught in adultery in front of Jesus, and they say, you know what? The law says she's supposed to be stoned. What do you do? And most people here probably know the story. If not, you can read it on your own. It's found in John 8. But Jesus disperses them to the point where it's just him and her left. And he says, where are those who are going to condemn you? She says, they're not here. And then he responds and says, I don't either. Go. Sin no more. In that single passage, you see the God who designed sex, the God who wrote the laws that they were trying to trap him in. You see Jesus, as it told us a moment ago in Hebrews, the one who is the exact imprint of God's nature. You see God handle his own truth. He designed sex, she broke it. He designed the laws that spoke about the punishment. But he's also the God, as we said a moment ago, whose ultimate desire is to rescue, restore, and to wash. And so he does two things simultaneously. He extends her grace while upholding his truth. You'll notice he does not sideswipe it. She's an adulteress. I've heard people that love to go into the whole thing about why wasn't the man brought in and where was the man and da-da-da-da. Doesn't matter. She broke the bonds of the marriage union. She was caught in the inversion of the sexual order. It doesn't matter if she's the wife and it was with somebody else, or if she was the mistress going into the marriage. Christ in no way, shape, or form says, it's no big deal. He extends grace and then says, but my truth stands. And the church, this has to be the kind of the fabric of our response, is that it's not just enough for us as a church to say it's wrong. It's not just enough for us to say it's a sin. We have to be people not just that claim to hold the truth, we have to be people that know how to handle the truth as well. Because God is a God that desires grace. God is a God that desires restoration. And the reason I go through all this is because when we talk with the outside culture, we have to be completely sensitive to this. The outside culture does not appeal to the same sources of authority that we do. They don't. That's why the question from the very beginning was that we would discuss God's opinion on this matter according to the scriptures. But the outside world, they appeal to a ton of other things. They appeal to rationality or reason, and so people will say, well, wait a second, think about how many people are gay in the world. It can't be wrong. God can't judge if it's that much. And they'll say over 10% of the global population, that's the current statistic that people use today. And so on the basis of the commonness of homosexuality, the world will say, clearly, God, it's not an anomaly. This is something, this is a part of our world. So God, and all of this, when people make these arguments, they are searching for an ethic so that they can hold God to their standard. Clearly, God can't judge it if it's this many people. They will also appeal to the causes of homosexuality. We saw this in the beginning, the classic statement today of God won't judge someone. If they're born this way, then God would have to be an incredibly angry, evil God to judge them. Let's skip that. And then ultimately, the argument regarding change in homosexuality. The outside world, and rightfully so, the outside world will point to the church and say, you have no solid case studies of any sizable number of people that have come to Christ and have suddenly turned into heterosexuals. And they're right, we don't. There is no army of thousands of people inside the church today going, yes, there's one or two cases that you can find on Facebook or that you can find on YouTube, but there is no large, sizable, and Christian psychologists, Christian pastors, Christian commentators, Christian scholars, there is no army of people going, we came to Jesus and he changed our desires to be heterosexual. And so the outside culture goes, and it's this phrase that has been attached to the church, that we are people who just preach, pray the gay away, to kind of point to the shallowness of our approach to it. And because the outside world appeals to these kinds of arguments as opposed to appealing to the scriptures and understanding the image that God has created, we're ships passing in the night sometimes. And if we hope to even have a dialogue, then we have to know how to handle the truth and have to handle grace simultaneously in the process. And one of the things that I want to be very clear about is this, is that for me to teach on this matter, for me to talk about how the church should respond, I want to make very clear that there is a very small element, there is a very small audience for me that I'm interested in talking to. And when I say me, I'm saying me personally, but I'm saying the church should approach it the same way. Because there's two parts of the argument that's going on today between the church and the culture. Here's the first argument. The first argument are the two sides, the two extreme sides that just want to yell at each other and debate. There's the part of the church that just wants to proof text the Bible and say, it's a sin and you're going to hell. Bottom line, they have no concern for grace. They have no concern for God's desire to clean and to restore and to woo and to win over. They just want to be right doctrinally. They could care less how it affects the other person. But equally problematic on the other side are those inside the LGBT community and just the culture as a whole, that their reason for engaging in the argument isn't because they really want to know who God is. They just want to expose what they believe to be the bigotry and hypocrisy of Christianity. And those two sides just shout at each other. And I have news for you. On either side, it's a losing debate. It's a waste. And the church should not waste its time in that discussion. But inside of that discussion, I do believe that there is a more sincere one that's taking place. I do believe that there are Christians who would approach it from this angle with friends, colleagues, family members, a brother, a sister, a cousin, a really good friend at high school, somebody that has admitted to same-sex orientation, that there are Christians who would say, I'm only wanting to talk to you because I'm concerned for your eternity, and that's it. I'm not trying to be right. I'm not trying to say that you're a sin. I just want the discussion because I love you and I'm concerned for you. And likewise, I do believe that there are sincere, honest people in the culture and who would identify inside of the LGBT community who would say, I do want to know what God thinks. I'm not looking to expose bigotry in the church. I'm just telling you, I can't be phony to myself. I can't be phony to what I know, I feel internally inside, but I do want to honestly know where God is in all this. And I believe that those two sides, if inside of the larger yelling match that goes on Facebook and social media and in our world around us, if those two more sincere conversations can meet, I believe Jesus would honor that kind of a conversation. And those are the kinds of conversations we should seek and be open to. If a person admits to having same-sex attractions, but they are sincere in their pursuit of God, we should listen and we should talk. If it's just, I want to prove you wrong, I've done research online and I'm going to prove to you that your scripture, bail on that conversation. And if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you came to just listen, but you understand this. If you encounter Christians that just want to prove text and point to you where you're going to hell, you bail on them. This conversation needs to be experienced in going through. And here's why I say this. This is the rapid fire segment. Hold on to your seats. There's another story in Scripture that, again, illustrates for us how I think we're supposed to understand the world's response to things. There's a man that's blind, and Jesus comes and chooses to heal him. Now, Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. It's the Sabbath. And as crazy as it may sound, you don't heal on the Sabbath. But it's more than that. Jesus, who could have just said, receive your sight, he doesn't. The scripture says that he comes and he grabs some dirt, spits in it, and he begins to, in front of everybody, so that they can see, because the crowd is gathered, he starts working it into mud in his hands. And then he takes the mud and he puts it on the guy's eyes. And the guy washes and he can see. Why all of this? Oh, because there was another Pharisaical law that was intended to say that you can't work on a Sabbath, and that included people in the pottery business. And so they would say, not only can you not put pots in the kiln, not only can you not glaze those pots, there was an actual Hebrew law that said you are not allowed to work dirt and water to clay on the Sabbath. And so what does Jesus do? He works water and dirt to clay. And so what happens is the man can see, and he has his sight, and everybody knows the guy in the town. And what happens? The Pharisees show up and they say, "What's happened?" He goes, "I can see." And they start saying, "You were never blind in the first place." And people go, "That's a stupid statement." And they say, "Well, the guy who healed you, where is he?" And he goes, I don't know. And they go, "Well, he's not the Son of God. He's a sinner." And to further it, they bring his parents into the center of town. They get his parents into it. And his parents are so scared of the religious tradition that his parents throw their own son under the bus. And they go, "Look, we don't know what happened. We weren't here. He's of age. He can speak for himself. Don't talk." They were just so scared of the religious tradition. And so the Pharisees are blasting the guy with theology. This man healed you on the Sabbath, and you don't heal on the Sabbath. And he mixed dirt and water, and he says he's the Son of God, and he's a heretic, and he's this, and they're just blasting him with theology. I mean, just destroying him with theology. And then the man says this, which is one of my favorite verses in all of the scriptures. He says, "I don't know. Look, I don't know if he's a sinner. I don't know. I only know one thing. I was blind, and now I see. Thank you very much. Good night, New York." That's it. I don't know about all your theology. I don't know all the rules about the Sabbath. I don't know if he is or if he isn't, or how he contradicted what you believed or what my parents believed. I only know one thing. I can see. That's it. That's all I got. That's all I have. I think there are people inside the LGBT community today that go, "Yes, I wrestle with this stuff. It is part of me. It's not something I made up. I don't know all the positions on the church or these things or the theology of human sexuality or God at creation, this, and I don't know Leviticus 18 or Romans 1. I've never even read the Bible for that. It's like, all I know is that I have honestly been pursuing God, and I wrestle with this, but I have sensed that God is calling and talking to me." And the church, unfortunately, sometimes takes more the role of the Pharisees going, "No," as opposed to going, we should open this line of dialogue. Because I think that there are so many that are in that position of going, I don't I'm just trying to make sense of this, and the church shuts the conversation down because we just want to be theologically correct. And I think that there are some fast responses. Give me the benefit of 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Incidentally, if you haven't figured this out, we're not doing gender fluidity tonight. We're going to make that up, not most likely. We were going to extend midweek into another week to cover the rest of this, but there are so many other things taking place this month. There are award banquets. Our kids are having some important events in Rangers and Impact, and we are not going to in any way, shape, or form rob them of that opportunity for parents to be with them. So we are going to do the last session in a video teaching similar to the way we did during COVID. We will record that. We'll put that online in the next 2 weeks. That'll be available for you to watch. So we're not ignoring it nor forgetting it. Just bring that up to you. But just let me have the benefit of the next 2 hours. Here we go. How do we respond? I think there's 3 key things. I think there's more, but for the purpose of tonight, I think there's 3 key ways that the church should respond. Again, I'm only talking about that segment of the LGBT community who would say, I'm seriously searching to understand and know God, not somebody who wants to argue and fight and debate. You with me? The first is this, that there needs to be a teaching that says, listen, there's a reason that you can't bring the I was born this way argument to bear. And it's not because we hate Lady Gaga, and it's not because we hate the LGBT community. It's not because we're trying to disarm you. It's not because, hear me on this. It's not because we're even trying to fight the science. I skipped a slide a moment ago from a gentleman by the name of Mark Yarhouse. You can research him yourself. He's a well-known, well-respected Christian psychologist who is highly respected in the Christian evangelical community, who himself for the last probably 15, 20 years has participated in major national studies with the same-sex orientation community to dig into these things. And he himself has said it's fruitless for the church to try to go and argue, oh, you can't be born that way. Because we have, what did I say at the very beginning of this? What has sin done to our creation? It's destroyed it. We, as part of the physical creation, are decaying. So the degree to which a person is a victim of nature, it's fruitless to even enter into that argument. I'm not saying a person can be born that way. I'm saying it's not worth our time to try to fight it from a scientific perspective. Why? Because it doesn't in any way, shape, or form affect the Christian response. Why? Because the truth is we are all born into sin. Every single one of us. Did somebody teach you how to be selfish? Did somebody teach you to be self-centered? Were you taught how to be angry? Were you taught how to be greedy? Were you taught how to be jealous? The question inside the church is not, were you born this way? The question we answer in the church is, how were we created to be? And how we were created to be is not how we are born today. We are all born completely opposite of how God originally intended. The scriptures say we are born into malice and anger and all kinds of sexual depravity and sin and hatred. Where every single person, there's no such thing as somebody who is born who does not need to surrender their life to Jesus Christ. And the only reason I say that is not a cop-out. It's to say that every single there is no such thing of an argument that is, I was born this way. And again, you're not looking for an argument. You're just saying to the person who is inside of the same-sex orientation community who would say, but I was born this way, the response from the church should be back to say, we need to guard you against using that argument. Because the outside world would say, so God would judge a person for how they... His judgment is upon the entirety of creation. Somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago when we finished our universalism teaching, they said, I'm still wrestling with this idea that God sends people to hell. And I said, let me change your thinking. I said, I don't know that the language, I said, and if I messed up in the universalism teaching, I said, take this as my correction. I said, you should not approach the scriptures from the angle that God sends people to hell. Because the scriptures actually don't so much teach that God sends people to hell as it teaches that God rescues people from hell. Hell is our natural predisposition. We are born hell-bound. The entirety of creation, because of what happened in the garden, all of us, hell because we disconnected from the Creator, hell, whatever you'll have to go back to our universalism teaching to understand more about what's behind that concept, but separation from God is what you were born into. All of us. God rescues us, or if we reject him, he allows us. But the sends us paints the portrait that he's And so when a person says, but I was born this way, that should not stop you from pursuing God to know not how you were born, but how you were created. How all of us were. Are you following with me? The second one is this. Is to teach this. This is our theology. Please hear me, because this is where the church gets it terribly wrong. God calls us, and when I say us, I mean every single human being. God calls us to sanctification. That is the call of every single person who says yes to Jesus. Why do I say that? Because we do a really distorted thing to the people in the same-sex oriented community. We kind of put them off into a separate camp like they're a leper colony. What the church has done for years is the church has set up this kind of teaching for the same-sex community that while God calls for us to be sanctified, God calls for them to be heterosexual. The call of God to the homosexual is not become a heterosexual. The call of God is to be sanctified and holy, and I'm going to unpackage that in just a moment if that makes any of you nervous. But that's the call for every single Christian. The call to you and I is not to never know jealousy again in our life. The call to you and I is to never know sexual urges again in our life. The call to the non-married is to don't you dare experience sexual temptation. No, the unmarried experiences sexual temptation. The call, though, is what do you do with that? The call is sanctification. Notice what James says again back in chapter 1, verse 14. He says, we're tempted when we're lured and enticed by our own desires, and then when desire conceives, it gives birth to what? For James, he completely divides the difference between the desires we wrestle with and sin. And for James, sin is when we give in to the desires, then the scriptures talk about sin being born. But experiencing inside of our members the results of our fallenness, anger, jealousy, malice, envy, deceit, control, manipulation, hatred, and any kind of sexual inversion, any of that takes place, the fact that the desires present themselves inside of you is not the evidence that you have fallen from God's grace if you have said yes to Christ. It means that you are still inside the tent of this fallen body. You follow with me? I only say all that because there is a stigma upon those that would even remotely admit to any kind of same-sex attraction. First off, they're scared to death to talk to the church in the first place because they think we're just throwing them out into the leper colony. The second thing is they get this notion that because they experience the attraction, just the desire, that God wants nothing to do with them. He wants everything to do with them. James makes the distinction. Paul teaches that there is such a thing in sanctification as the ability to see these desires overridden by the Spirit's drive, the Spirit's control. Paul himself talks about this self-control that takes place. Paul then says in 1 Corinthians, he talks about his own sanctification. He says, I will not be controlled by anything, not food, not sex. Paul talks about his own sanctification, about what it means to surrender himself to the Spirit's leading, to the Spirit bringing back the ability for us to override those appetites and to leave a life of holiness to God. The call for you, the call for me is the same as the call for the person who would say, I have these same-sex attractions. I don't know what to do with it. Can the church lead me and guide me? And the answer is, you are not different than the rest of us. You are called to surrender your life to Christ and to experience sanctification and to pursue spiritual empowerment and to find and wrestle. You do your wrestling with God. And why do I say you're wrestling? Because the church has a hypocrisy issue when it comes to same-sex orientation. I've used these statistics before. We're wrapping up. Hang in there with me. I've used these statistics before. A recent survey shows that 68% of Christian men, 68% of Christian men admit to daily addictions to pornography. 68%. But if you've got same-sex attraction, you're going to hell. But God understands. Yeah, right. Statistics 15 years ago, were that more than 45% of marriages ending in divorce were Christian marriages. 45%. And I heard somebody the other day, I was reading a study the other day where they were talking about how that number has dropped over the last 10 years. And I saw one of the most brilliant responses where a person said, it's dropped, but not because things are better. It's dropped because there has been an increase in the number of people just living together. The reason they're not ending in divorce is because they've chosen not to get married in the first place. So they're just sleeping together. And churches go, we just don't ask, don't tell. And so churches have tons of couples that come in on Sunday morning, raise their hands. I love you, Jesus. I love you. I love you. I love you. They're not married. They're sleeping together. Same sex, that's the leper colony. But the rest of you, God understands your sexual urges. God understands that you need to be with her at night. Oh, I got another one. Recent study of people who are obese has shown that Christians are 20% more likely to be obese than a non-Christian. Christians are 20% more likely to be obese than a non-Christian. We're the ones who are saying we're controlled by the Spirit. We get control of our appetites. We, as a church, are fatter than those that don't have the Spirit. How is that possible? And I can make that, I can make that claim because this boy 3 years ago, I was tipping the scales at 280. Not telling you my weight today, but it's not 280. I make all that statement to say this. I won't make this statement. I'll let Jesus make this statement. He's the one that said, how dare you try to remove the speck out of your brother's eye when you got the log in your own? Paul then says, in Romans chapter 2, and here's the beauty of Romans chapter 1, so many people that want to argue against homosexuality, they stop at Romans 1. They go, Romans 1 says homosexuality is a sin. And it does. If I have not been clear enough tonight, and I will be in a moment, we are saying that acting upon the same-sex orientation, acting upon those desires, engaging upon them, it is sinful because it is contrary to God's design. We're saying that. However, what people miss is that the reason Paul goes into length about how lost the world is in chapter 1 is because he needs to bring an indictment against the church. And in Romans chapter 2, he said, so many people quit. Remember what I said at the very beginning of last week? I said we have to take words in the context of sentences, sentences in the context of paragraphs, paragraphs in the context of chapters, chapters in the context of books. Romans chapter 1 makes no sense without Romans chapter 2, where Paul says, you, that's the believer, you therefore, you have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. Because at whatever point you judge someone else, you're condemning yourself. Because you pass judgment, you're doing the same things. Now, we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on his truth. We know that. So when you, a mere human, pass judgment, you're not God. And when you pass judgment on others, and yet you entertain the same thing inside of yourself, how are you going to escape God's judgment? Same sex is wrong, but we entertain sex outside of marriage. Same sex is wrong, but we entertain all kinds of greed and jealousy and lust and malice and all. But it's not sin. We've created this thing where we think that homosexuality is this special category of sin. It's not. It is a sin It is an activity, is it an orientation that is evidence of the fallen world, and the call for the individual who would say, I'm in this space and I want to just know what I'm supposed to do. The call of the church to them is the same as the call of the church to every single other person here. It is called to sanctification, a pursuit of Christ and of his Spirit's empowerment. It's the same exact walk. We need to do a better job calling ourselves to it. We've lost some of our own authority because we're not walking it ourselves. All right, we're going to move on and close this out. Here's the last one. The last one is that to a person who would come and say, I believe I'm a gay Christian, our counsel should be, your sexuality cannot be your identity. This is something that our culture has infused upon people in the same-sex world that is a complete deterrent from their ability to know who God is, and here's why. There is no such thing as a gay Christian, for the same reason that there's no such thing as a heterosexual Christian, or a Jewish Christian, or a Gentile Christian, or a man Christian, or a female Christian, or a woman Christian, because the call of Christ to know him has been simple and has been clear from the beginning. You want to know his life, you lose yours. It's the reason that Paul goes into length in the New Testament. There's no Jew, there's no Gentile. There is no such thing as you bringing your own identity to God and attaching it to the identity that he wants to give you. You don't do it. And the way the world has confused those in the same-sex space is to suggest that their sexuality is their identity. And that's actually something unique. You do your own reading on this. But it's actually unique to within the last 15 to 20 years inside of the Western society, this notion of identities, LGBTQ, giving it a label, flags for a sexuality. What does a flag do? It rallies a group of people. It puts them under a certain banner and identity. But yet, what is the teaching of the church? The teaching of the church is not that gay people can't have that identity. The teaching of the church is nobody owns their own identity. You come to Christ and you die. You surrender yourself. You surrender your claim to yourself. You surrender your claim to your own identity. You surrender your claim to your own rights. You do not bring anything. You come before God and say, I surrender everything. I am nothing except what you would say that I am. That's the teaching. That's the guidance. How do we close it out? As with everything, I like to write positions. Here is how I think we would position ourselves when it comes to this topic. Same-sex attraction is a result of the fallen condition of our world. While the attraction or the desire in and of itself is not considered outside the normal fallen experience of humanity, the scriptures do define the engagement, keywords, or participation in same-sex activity as sinful. They do. There's no way around that. And if you're here tonight and you were hoping I was going to say something other than that, I can't. Because it doesn't matter what I think, it only matters what the scriptures say. And the scriptures define the engagement in it as sinful. Primarily, it counters God's original design, which was intended to reflect his image and his relationship with his creation. This is the why. Specifically, it rejects God's image through the relationship between the genders and the life-producing capacity of their sexual union. That's the why. It erases God's image because it removes the corresponding gender and it removes the life-giving capacity that God wove into the illustration. People would say, but we love it. The purpose of sex was not your own fulfillment. The purpose of sex was the illustration of the Creator. And anything inside of that, like I said, Leviticus 18 for your bedtime reading. The person experiencing same-sex attraction is not, however, blocked from a fruitful pursuit of Christ. And so that, again, so that you don't confuse anything, I said the person experiencing same-sex attraction, I should have probably said the person who would say that they have an orientation is not blocked from a fruitful pursuit of Christ. We hold they can know both the gift of salvation as well as the empowerment of the Spirit if they pursue a life of sanctification and surrender that seeks the Spirit's fruit of self-control over the attractions. And so we're not confused here. That's true for every single person in this room. This is not a unique position written for those inside the homosexual community. That's true for every single Christian walking the earth today. There is no such thing as God just understanding that desire that has manipulated you. There is no such thing as God just giving grace for you indulging every so often because I just lost. No. Every single one of us are supposed to understand what this surrender means, the power of fasting, the power of prayer, the power of a surrendered walk. The church should embrace those who want the open dialogue, but also are sincere about a scripture-based pursuit of Christ. This is, in my opinion, the way we should approach this. To me, this honors the person's questions. This does not try to engage in those areas we are not experts in, like science or psychology. We are not trying to answer questions about whether there is genetic predisposition or not. That's not our space. Our space is the church, is the scriptures and God, and what it means to pursue him. And I think that this honors that person who is honestly seeking. It upholds the truth of God's word, and it does it in a manner that, just like Jesus said to the woman caught in adultery, that God wants to forgive, he wants to give grace, he wants to give sanctification, but there has to be sin no more. You with me? Let me close this in prayer. Father, I stand before you in sincere just concern, because I do not want to misrepresent you. There are people's souls on the line that we know in our culture today. They are experiencing the fallen world, and it may be in a way different than we experience it. And this seems to be the lightning rod. The same-sex attraction space seems to be the lightning rod. And my prayer is that you would make us people that are knowledgeable about your word, that we know how to uphold the truth, that we know how to define it, and that we know how to define your heart, and that we would not in any way, shape, or form acquiesce to the culture's demands, that we water it down. But at the same time, that you would give us the heart and the wisdom that was in you when you were standing there over that woman in the streets, and that we could show the way to forgiveness, that we could show the way to sanctification, that we could teach the pathway to eternity without the argumentation, the vitriol, and all the other stuff that goes with it. So I pray tonight that if in any way, shape, or form this wasn't clear, or if I misspoke, or if I misrepresented you, that you would allow clarification through your Spirit's abilities beyond my own. In Jesus' name, everybody said.